For decades, England had drifted away from Catholic control. Henry VIII's break with Rome was one thing, but Elizabeth's stubborn insistence on Protestant settlement and her excommunication by the Pope in 1570 made her not just a political enemy, but in Philip's eyes, a heretic usurper. This was no ordinary quarrel over territory or taxes. To Philip, Elizabeth's England was a rebellion against the universal church, a wound in Christendom. He would dress his political ambitions in robes of piety, declaring that he sought to bring England back into the Catholic fold. In reality, he also saw an opportunity to cripple a rival whose navy and privateers were gnawing at his empire like rats at a granary. Drake's raids had humiliated Spain repeatedly. In 1587 he struck Cadiz, burning ships in harbour in what he cheerfully called singeing the King of Spain's beard. Spanish galleons were harassed in the Atlantic, their holds stuffed with silver plundered from the Americas. Every ship lost to English privateers was not only wealth destroyed, but honour insulted. Philip was a man who valued control above all, and England's insolence infuriated him. But it wasn't only Elizabeth's corsairs or her Protestant stubbornness. Philip also saw the hand of God offering him opportunity. In his mind, the Armada would not simply be a fleet, it would be a crusade, a holy enterprise to restore Catholic truth. He carried with him the memory of Lepanto, that great naval victory of 1571, where Christian fleets had smashed the Ottoman Turks. If God had favoured him against the infidel, surely he would favour him now against the heretic. Here's your cheeky aside. Imagine pitching this plan to a medieval marketing team. Product: God's Armada. Target audience: the faithful of Europe. Slogan: this time we'll definitely invade England. The king believed no one could refuse such branding, except of course the unpredictable English weather. Still, Philip's reasoning wasn't entirely cloaked in religion. England's support for the Dutch revolt stung just as sharply. The Netherlands were the jewel of Philip's crown, rich in trade and taxes, but they were also ablaze with rebellion. Dutch rebels, funded and supplied by England, gnawed at Spanish authority. To conquer England would be to cut off the rebels' lifeline. The Armada was thus both sword and scissors, strike Elizabeth and sever Dutch resistance in one blow. Philip imagined a simple sequence. His fleet would sail from Spain, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's seasoned army in the Low Countries, ferry them across the Channel, and land them on England's southern shores. There, with Parma's infantry marching and Spain's faith blazing, Elizabeth would topple, Protestants would scatter, and the Pope's blessing would sanctify his triumph. In Philip's mind, it was not just plausible, it was inevitable. What he underestimated was the sheer logistical nightmare such an enterprise entailed. Spain had ships, yes, and soldiers, and resources wrung from an empire stretching from Peru to the Philippines, but coordinating fleets and armies across stormy seas against a nimble and aggressive English navy required more than faith and silver. It required a commander with salt in his veins. Philip had none to spare. He believed his meticulous planning could replace experience. Pages of instructions were written in his cramped hand, detailing every movement of the Armada as if battles could be fought with ink alone. He micromanaged admirals, generals, even quartermasters, convinced that God's plan was best expressed through his own control. But the sea is no courtier. It does not bow to decree. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had been watching. Her spies, led by the wily Francis Walsingham, fed her streams of intelligence from Spain. She knew the storm was brewing, and though she lacked Spain's resources, she had her own weapon, an island's stubborn resilience. Philip ignored these truths. In his council chambers, surrounded by maps and priests, he chose to believe in destiny. The Armada was more than ships. It was prophecy. To delay was to invite sin. So he declared it. The fleet would save Spain's honour, Catholicism's cause, and his own soul demanded nothing less. Across Europe, whispers spread. Some called it folly, others foresaw triumph. In taverns of Antwerp and Seville, men raised mugs and swore that England would soon kneel. In London, rumours of invasion ran like fever, mothers whispering prayers for their children, men polishing pikes and muskets. The Channel became the thin thread on which two nations dangled. Philip, ever cautious in personal life yet ruthless in politics, signed the orders with solemnity. His lips moved in prayer, his eyes cast upward. The Armada was no mere fleet. It was an offering to God, and like every offering, it required sacrifice. He just didn't yet know how much. The decision had been made. The course was set. Spain would stake its empire, its faith, and its king's pride on a gamble against wind, tide, and an island queen. The Armada was born, not in harbours of timber and tar, but in the mind of a king who believed he could bend the sea itself to his will. Once Philip II made his decision, Spain's shipyards roared to life like hives of industry. Along the coasts of Spain and Portugal, hammers rang against iron, saws screeched through timber, and the salty air was filled with the smell of tar, pitch, and oak shavings. The Armada was not a single fleet, but a vast assembly drawn from across an empire that stretched across continents. Galleons from Andalusia, carracks from Lisbon, galleasses from Naples, and hulking supply hulks from Biscay were pressed into service. Philip's clerks and admirals counted and recounted until they settled on numbers that awed Europe. More than 130 ships, 8,000 sailors, 19,000 soldiers, and thousands more oarsmen, gunners, and servants. On paper, it was a floating kingdom. The crown requisitioned timber from Castile, hemp from Galicia, and iron from the Basque foundries. Cannons were forged in Toledo, then rolled creaking on ox carts to the ports. Monks and priests blessed the keels, sprinkling holy water across decks that would soon smell less of incense than of sweat and bilge. Spain's empire had poured silver into its coffers for decades, and now that treasure was turned into hulls and cannonballs, crossbows and pikes. The Armada was the most expensive gamble Philip had ever undertaken, but size was not the same as suitability. Many of the ships were not warships at all, but merchant vessels hurriedly converted, sturdy enough to cross the Atlantic with silver. They were slow and clumsy in the tight maneuvers of naval battle. The galleasses, half-galley, half-sailing ship, bristled with cannon, but needed calm seas to row effectively. There were magnificent galleons, tall, broad, heavily armed, but not nearly enough of them. The Armada looked imposing in harbour, but in truth it was a patchwork fleet, some ships destined more for carrying supplies than fighting. The weapons, too, told of imbalance. Spanish cannon were powerful, but they were designed for close-range broadsides. The Armada's tactics rested on bringing ships alongside the enemy, grappling them with hooks, and boarding in waves of armoured soldiers. Spain's soldiers were superb on land, drilled in the deadly tertial formations of pike and shot, and Philip imagined they would carry that dominance onto the sea. Yet, the ocean was no battlefield of steady ranks. It was a restless rolling stage, and the English had designed their ships for gunnery at range. Still, the sheer scale inspired awe. Ports groaned with barrels of flour, salted fish, dried beans, and wine. Barrels of water were loaded, though no one believed they would last fresh beyond a few weeks. Crosses were raised on decks, altars prepared for mass, and priests assigned to nearly every vessel. Sailors grumbled at the lack of space, forced to sleep beside cannon or on damp decks. Soldiers cursed the food already spoiling before they left port. Horses for cavalry crowded stinking holds, seasick before they even saw open water. Logistics strained under the ambition of empire. The sailors themselves were a polyglot mixture: Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, Flemings, even slaves chained to oars. Communication was clumsy, discipline harsh, punishment often brutal. Many had been pressed into service unwillingly, hauled from taverns or seized from coastal villages. Others were hardened veterans of Atlantic trade, their faces lined by sun and salt. Together they formed a crew vast enough to fill a city but uneasy in its diversity. Officers were appointed with care, though not always wisdom. Many were nobles chosen for loyalty to Philip, rather than for naval expertise. Few had the salty instincts of born seamen. The Armada's most famous vice-admiral, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, would later admit he suffered from seasickness and ignorance of naval command. But Spain valued obedience more than innovation. Orders were expected to carry the day, not improvisation. Work in the ports dragged on for months. Supplies rotted as they waited, ropes frayed in the damp, and men died of disease before the fleet even left. Philip, secluded in the Escorial, demanded reports, corrections, more prayers, more resources. Clerks grew frantic, captains swore, priests preached sermons about destiny. The Armada was supposed to be God's fleet, yet it already bore the scars of human error. Nevertheless, when mustered together, it was a sight to strike fear. Masts rose like forests, sails billowed with the colours of Spain and Portugal, and banners of saints flapped in the wind. Pilgrims kissed relics carried on board. Captains swore oaths before crucifixes. Watching from the shore, commoners wept at the grandeur, convinced they were seeing God's will afloat. It was more than a fleet, it was an idea, an empire condensed into wood and iron. Here's your cheeky aside. Imagine being a sailor crammed on one of those hulks. You're wedged between a horse, a barrel of beans already smelling foul, and a priest who insists on singing hymns at dawn. You'd think if God doesn't sink us, indigestion will. Holiness doesn't sweeten spoiled rations. The Armada's muster was intended to overwhelm England by sheer bulk. Philip believed Elizabeth's smaller navy would scatter before it, cowed by numbers. He dreamed of his ships forming an invincible crescent across the Channel, escorting Parma's army like a moving wall of steel. The vision was grand, but visions are lighter than water, and water has a way of swallowing them. In the shipyards and arsenals, workmen muttered of delays, sailors muttered of storms, and captains muttered of poor charts. But above all muttering, prayers rose. Priests declared that God himself was the Armada's pilot, that no heretic wind could blow against the holy mission. The people of Spain believed it. Philip believed it. The Armada, heavy with supplies and heavier still with expectation, was nearly ready to sail into legend. The grandest fleet in Christendom may have looked terrifying, on paper, but a fleet is only as steady as the hands steering it. And here lay one of the Armada's gravest weaknesses, its leadership. At the top sat Don Alonso Pérez de Guzmán, better known as the Duke of Medina Sidonia. On land, he was one of Spain's most respected nobles. At sea, however, he was an impostor in his own uniform. He had no naval experience, had rarely sailed before, and confessed to Philip II in letters that he was seasick by nature. Imagine being asked to command 130 ships while keeping a bucket nearby. Hardly the image of divine destiny. So why him? Because loyalty mattered more than skill. Philip had originally intended the brilliant admiral the Marquis of Santa Cruz to lead, but Santa Cruz died before the Armada could launch. Faced with a vacuum, Philip looked for a man he could trust absolutely, someone of noble birth who would obey instructions to the letter. Medina Sidonia fit the bill. He was cautious, disciplined, obedient, and utterly out of his depth at sea. This was a common theme. Across the Armada, command posts often went to grandees, nobles whose pedigrees gleamed brighter than their charts. Many were excellent soldiers, but poor sailors. Spanish naval tradition itself was split. Some ships had captains for sailing, and others for fighting, leading to clashes between professional seamen and noble commanders. Orders could contradict, tempers could flare, and no single man had the salty authority to cut through confusion when the winds turned foul. Philip II believed he could solve this with paperwork. His instructions to Medina Sidonia ran for pages, outlining every maneuver, every rendezvous, every detail of how to meet Parma's army and ferry it across. The king believed he could command the sea from his study in the Escorial, as if wind and tide were courtiers bound to obey his ink. To Medina Sidonia, the sheer weight of those orders felt like an anchor. He wrote back pleading for release from the post, insisting he lacked the ability. Philip's response was curt. God had chosen him, and he would obey. That was that. The Armada did boast some competent officers. Juan Martinez de Recalde was a seasoned admiral, brave and skilled, but his advice often clashed with Medina Sidonia's caution. Don Alonso de Leyva, a brilliant commander and veteran of land campaigns, burned with zeal and urged aggressive tactics. But in a fleet this large, even sharp minds dulled in the tangle of hierarchy. Each ship's captain owed loyalty to the crown first. the admiral second, and often quarrelled over how to execute orders. Then there was Parma. The Duke of Parma, Philip's brilliant nephew, commanded a veteran army in the Netherlands, 30,000 strong, disciplined and ready to invade England, but his coordination with the Armada depended on timing that was laughably optimistic. Parma's troops were bottled up by Dutch rebel fleets, blockaded in shallow waters unsuited to Spain's deep-draught galleons. Even if Medina Sidonia reached the rendezvous point, Parma had no easy way to embark. The grand plan assumed miracles of logistics and weather that no admiral could guarantee. Meanwhile, on the English side, leadership sparkled with energy. Lord Charles Howard of Effingham, though not a naval genius, listened to his captains, and among those captains was Francis Drake, the wily privateer who knew every trick of harassment and sudden strike. John Hawkins, master shipbuilder and tactician, understood how English gunnery could outpace Spain's boarding tactics. Their chain of command was leaner, their experience saltier. Where Philip trusted obedience, Elizabeth trusted initiative. Here's your cheeky aside. Imagine being Medina Sidonia, handed command of the invincible Armada, but you've barely rowed a fishing boat in your life. You're clutching the king's mile-long instruction list, seasick on deck, and muttering, "God, I hope this isn't a test." If naval battles were won by devotion alone, Spain would have been unstoppable. As preparations dragged on, cracks widened, ships were delayed, supplies spoiled, sailors deserted. Medina Sidonia's correspondence grew frantic, filled with complaints about inadequate charts, weak ships, poor provisions. Philip brushed it all aside with prayers and proclamations. God would provide. The Armada was not just a fleet, he insisted, it was destiny afloat. But destiny cannot trim sails or plot courses. The Armada's command was built on faith, hierarchy and paperwork, not on salt and experience, and when the fleet finally sailed into the Channel, it carried not only soldiers and cannon, but also confusion, hesitation and a commander who prayed he would not vomit before he had to give the next order. The Denisovans roamed far, but when you return to their first discovery place, that cave in Siberia, you feel the true weight of their resilience. For the Altai Mountains are not gentle. Winters there gnaw at bone, the cold slicing through furs and flesh alike. Snow lies heavy across valleys, winds howl through trees, rivers freeze solid. To survive in such a place was not accident. It was adaptation, ingenuity, endurance. Denisovans were masters of the cold. Picture them moving through taiga forest, the crunch of snow beneath their feet. The air stings lungs, each breath white cloud. Children cling to mothers' furs. Hunters walk with spears strapped tight, their eyes scanning for elk, bison, woolly rhinoceros. Fires wait in caves behind them, embers still glowing, warmth they will need to reach again. The cold is enemy, constant and unrelenting, but Denisovans learn to live with it. What did they wear? No cloth remains, but bone needles, found in Denisova cave, whisper of tailored clothing, furs stitched together to wrap bodies fully. Unlike earlier humans who may have draped hides loosely, Denisovans likely sewed garments close to skin, creating insulation against bitter winds. Each stitch was survival, each thread the difference between life and death. Their tools, too, were adapted to climate. Stone blades for cutting frozen meat, scrapers for working hides stiff from frost, bone awls for piercing fur. Fires burned hot in caves, fueled by wood carried from forests. Imagine trudging through snow with bundle of branches, arms aching, knowing fire is life itself. Without flame, without fur, without shelter, the cold would swallow them in hours. Food, too, was challenge. Winters stripped forests bare, left plains empty. Denisovans hunted great beasts, their spears tipped with stone, their coordination precise. Elk, horse, perhaps mammoth fell to their hunts. Meat shared, hides stripped, bones cracked for marrow, fat was prized. Fire roasted to fuel bodies through freezing nights. In cold, Food was not luxury but constant necessity, and yet they thrived. Evidence suggests Denisovans were not only enduring cold, but mastering it. Their bodies may have been stocky, broad-chested, lungs strong, blood thick with adaptations against frost. Their very DNA reveals mutations tied to survival in harsh climates, passed down into modern humans who still benefit from their ancient resilience. Humor softens this thought. Imagine a Denisovan child complaining, "It's too cold to go outside," and the mother replying, "If you don't fetch wood, we all freeze." Some struggles are timeless. Even in Ice Age, children grumbled, parents scolded, families laughed through frostbite. Humanity has always needed humor to endure hardship. The cave itself was sanctuary. Thick walls sheltered against winds, fires warmed stone. Inside, families huddled together, heat shared through bodies as much as flame. Shadows danced along walls, laughter mixed with crackle of fire. Stories filled the air. Outside the world froze, but inside, life pulsed strong. Denisova Cave was not only shelter, it was home. Archaeologists uncover layers of ash, evidence of repeated fires burning for centuries. Imagine smoke curling upward, staining ceilings black. Each generation added its embers to the same hearths, each child growing up in warmth carved by ancestors. The cave was continuity, a thread of survival through endless winters, and their resilience shaped identity. To live in cold was to respect fire, to honor beasts, to plan carefully. Waste meant death. Laziness meant starvation. Denisovans must have built cultures of discipline, of sharing, of reverence for resources. Their survival was not brute endurance, but organized cooperation. Consider, too, the silence of such winters. Outside, snow-muffled sound, air heavy with stillness. Inside, fires crackled, voices rose, songs perhaps echoed. Music may have been born as much from need to break silence as from joy. A flute carved from bone could carry sound through dark, lifting spirits against long cold nights. The cold also shaped their migrations. To survive in Siberia was to adapt quickly, but it also taught them to move when needed. Perhaps some families pushed south in harsh winters, seeking forests rich in game. Others climbed mountains, others followed herds. The cold was teacher, forcing flexibility, ensuring Denisovans spread widely, and the cold shaped their encounters. When Homo sapiens later wandered into Asia, Denisovans already knew how to survive its extremes. Perhaps they taught us, showing where to hunt, how to stitch furs, how to breathe in high places. Perhaps they competed fiercely, driving us from caves they mastered. Either way, their knowledge of cold was part of legacy they left. Even now, fragments of their DNA help modern people adapt. The EPAS-1 gene, inherited from Denisovans, lets Tibetans thrive in thin air of plateau. Other fragments strengthen immune systems, helping resist diseases. Their survival strategies live on, coded into us, ancient gifts against modern challenges. Picture a winter night, 40,000 years ago. Outside, snow drives hard, wolves howl, rivers lie frozen. Inside, Denisovans gather by fire, children curled in furs, elders telling stories, hunters sharpening tools. They laugh softly, they sing, they plan hunts, they dream. The cold presses outside, but within, warmth glows. They are not victims of Ice Age, but masters of it, shaping lives around its demands. As you drift tonight, imagine yourself in that cave. Furs wrap you, fire warms you, voices murmur in language lost but familiar. Outside, snow falls endlessly, but inside you are safe, carried by ancestors who once conquered cold. Denisovans whisper that survival is not only strength, but community, ingenuity, love. Their mastery of cold is legacy we still carry, breath by breath, gene by gene. The cold demanded endurance, but endurance alone was never enough. To live through the Ice Age, Denisovans needed more than fur and fire. They needed tools, not just crude shards, but objects of precision, crafted to cut, scrape, pierce, stitch. They needed ornaments too, beads and pendants that spoke of more than hunger and cold, of identity and beauty. In Denisova Cave, buried in the layers of ash and soil, these objects have been found, fragments of craft that whisper of a people who were more than survivors. They were makers, artisans, inventors. Picture a hunter kneeling beside a carcass of elk in snow. In his hand, a flake of stone, sharp as glass, edges chipped with skill. With steady pressure he slices hide, muscles practiced in movements taught by generations. Around him, others prepare scrapers to clean fur, awls to pierce tough skin, knives to butcher meat. These are not random shards, but carefully shaped tools, their edges retouched, their forms deliberate. Bone too became material. From ribs and antlers came awls and needles, some drilled with tiny holes for threading fibers or sinew. Imagine a mother bent close to fire, squinting as she pushes sinew through needle, stitching fur garments for her children. Her fingers are nimble, her movements precise. This is not guesswork, but technology. The ability to turn bone into instruments that change how humans live. In cold Siberia, a stitched coat meant life itself. Archaeologists believe some of these ornaments may have been worn as status markers, perhaps tokens of belonging or love. Imagine a girl receiving that green bracelet from her kin, slipping it onto her wrist, wearing it proudly as she danced by fire. Even in Ice Age Siberia, humans love to decorate, to say this is me, this is ours, this is beautiful. The tools themselves reveal intelligence. Edges retouched, flakes struck with precision, angles calculated for strength. To make such objects required planning, knowledge passed from teacher to learner, memory carried across generations. Children watched elders flake stone, learning where to strike, how to read lines of fracture. In those lessons, culture grew, not only skill but tradition. Tools also travelled. A blade made in one layer of cave appears again in another, generations apart. This continuity shows tradition, styles passed down, methods preserved. Denisovans did not reinvent constantly. They remembered, improved, taught. Their craft was lineage, just as much as blood. And yet, they innovated. Bone needles suggest clothing stitched tightly, not draped. Ornaments show aesthetic sense. Polished stone tools show patience. Denisovans were not static but dynamic, always adapting, refining, pushing boundaries of what tools could be. Their range across Asia suggests diverse toolkits. In forests they may have made traps and digging sticks. In mountains, heavy blades for bone. In islands, perhaps rafts or simple boats. Though evidence is thin, their survival across such varied climates suggests ingenuity. Each environment demanded new solutions, and Denisovans found them. Tools also shaped identity. To wear certain ornaments may have marked kinship. To carry certain blade styles may have signaled belonging. Craft was not just survival but social expression. Through tools, Denisovans spoke language of culture, silent yet powerful. Children played with scraps, imitating elders. They chipped small stones, strung pebbles into pretend beads, tried to stitch scraps of hide. Their play was training, their laughter seeds of future artisans. Even games wove culture forward. The beauty of their ornaments startles even today. The green bracelet gleams as if made by jeweler, its drill marks so precise. Some scientists suggest rotary tools were used. Imagine the patience of maker, hours spent smoothing, polishing, shaping, drilling. This was not made in haste, but in love, devotion, art. To hold it is to feel presence of mind that cared for beauty as much as warmth, and beauty itself had power. Ornaments may have been gifts to spirits, charms for luck, tokens for love, to wear beads or bracelets as to carry meaning, to show connection not only to living but perhaps to ancestors, to unseen. Craft bridged survival and belief. Humor persists even here. Imagine a youth presenting crooked bead as gift, the hole drilled uneven, the shape awkward, the girl laughs, teasing, yet wears it anyway. Imperfection too carried love. The makers surely chuckled at their own errors, turning failure into memory. Archaeologists find tiny fragments, flakes, bones, beads, and from them reconstruct worlds. Each tool, each ornament is whisper from past, saying, "We were more than hunger, more than survival. We made, we oded, we loved beauty." Denisovans remind us that to be human is to craft meaning from stone and bone. Picture yourself now in Denisova Cave. Fire glows, shadows stretch. Beside you a man chips stone, sparks flying. A woman stitches fur with bone needle. Children string beads into necklace. Laughter filling air. Tools and ornaments lie scattered, shining faintly in firelight. Outside, cold rages, but inside, culture thrives. And as you close your eyes tonight, imagine those hands working, those needles stitching, those beads gleaming. Denisovans teach that survival is not only endurance but creativity, not only strength but craft. Their tools and ornaments whisper across ages, reminding us that we are makers, always, even in coldest nights. The Denisovans proved themselves in icy Siberia, stitching furs with bone needles and carving beauty into stone. But perhaps their most astonishing feat was not in cold forests or dark caves. It was high in the sky on the roof of the world, long before most humans could even dream of surviving at such heights. Denisovans mastered the thin air of the Tibetan plateau. Their genes gave them power to breathe where others would faint, to thrive where mountains touch the heavens. In this they earned a title no other humans of their time could claim, masters of altitude. Picture the plateau itself. The land is vast and open, stretching endlessly, a horizon broken only by snow-capped peaks. The air is thin, every breath like pulling through straw. The proof lies in a jawbone found in Baishia Karst Cave, nestled at nearly 11,000 feet above sea level. Its teeth were massive, its age staggering, about 160,000 years old. When proteins were tested, the verdict was clear. Denisovan. Imagine that. While Neanderthals huddled in Europe and early Homo sapiens still roamed Africa, Denisovans were already perched on mountains so high the sky itself seemed closer. They were breathing air most of us would struggle to survive in for more than a few days. How did they manage it? The answer hides not only in fossils but in genes. A mutation known as EPAS1, passed into modern Tibetans, gives their blood an edge. Unlike other humans, Tibetans do not flood their systems with red blood cells in thin air, a dangerous response that leads to clots and sickness. Instead, thanks to Denisovan DNA, their bodies use oxygen more efficiently. In other words, Denisovans engineered adaptation into their very blood, then gifted it to descendants who still climb mountains today. Life on the plateau demanded more than lungs. Food was scarce, winters cruel, resources thin. Denisovans likely hunted wild yaks, sheep and gazelles, tracking them across rocky slopes. They must have gathered roots and hardy plants, Melted snow for water, stored fat against long winters. Fires were harder to keep alight in thin air, yet they burned them anyway, smoke curling into sky like signal to gods above. Imagine a Denisovan family crouched in Baishia cave. The father sharpens a stone blade, the mother stirs a pot of marrow and roots. The children play with pebbles, their laughter echoing in high air. Outside, wind howls like spirit's voice. Snow drives across plateau. Stars blaze sharper than anywhere else. Yet inside they are warm, adapted, thriving. What would make us dizzy with hypoxia was simply home to them. This adaptation gave them power beyond survival. When Homo sapiens finally wandered into Asia, we struggled with altitude. Our bodies weakened, our breaths failed, but those who mingled with Denisovans, interbreeding in valleys near the Himalayas, inherited genes that made the impossible livable. Without Denisovans, Tibetans might never have mastered their plateau, and mountaineers today might not climb Everest without help from ancient cousins' DNA. It is humbling to realize that your ability to trek high mountains, to gasp a little less desperately at 12,000 feet, is not wholly your own. It is gift from people long gone, cousins whose faces we have never seen. Denisovans do not live, yet they live in blood of those who still walk the mountains they once called home. And with altitude came belief. Standing at such heights where clouds drift beneath feet and stars feel within reach, it is easy to imagine Denisovans saw land as sacred. Perhaps they believed spirits dwelled in peaks, ancestors whispered in winds, gods thundered in storms. High places invite faith. Their descendants still see mountains as holy, echo of beliefs carved deep into plateau long before written myths. What amazes archaeologists is not only that Denisovans lived at altitude, but that they did so early, long before Homo sapiens arrived. They were pioneers of thin air, mastering environment others could not endure. It suggests they were not fringe population, but innovators, always pushing edges of what human bodies could do, and their adaptation rippled outward. The IPAS1 gene is striking evidence of Denisovan legacy, but there are others, immune adaptations, metabolic traits, hints of changes that allowed humans to survive environments ranging from tundra to tropics. Denisovans were experimenters of evolution, carrying traits that later became crucial to survival. Picture a night on plateau. Fires burn in stone-walled shelter, sparks swirling into thin sky. A family huddles, telling stories in language we will never hear again. They laugh, they sing, their voices rising thin but clear into night. Outside, stars crowd closer, as if listening. They are not suffering, they are thriving, masters of heights no other human lineage dared to claim. Even now, their presence lingers. Walk through Tibetan valleys, see faces of herders, hear laughter of children chasing yaks. Their blood carries whispers of Denisovans, their lungs shaped by ancient cousins. They live in present, but past still breathes in them, quiet and unseen. And so the story of Denisovans is not confined to bones or caves. It flows in air of mountains, in genes of herders, in lungs of climbers. They were masters of altitude, pioneers of thin air, givers of gifts that endure. Their faces are lost, but their breath is still ours. As you drift tonight, imagine lying on Tibetan slope, stars fierce above, air thin yet sweet. You breathe deeply, lungs strong, heart steady, carried by gifts of ancestors. The Denisovans whisper in every breath, "We climbed before you, we breathed before you, we endure in you." Let their presence comfort you. The sleep descends gently like snow upon the peaks. On the evening of July 19, 1588, watchfires flared along the Cornish coast. From Plymouth to Dover, beacons blazed in sequence, their smoke curling skyward, their flames licking the night air. The signal had been passed. The Armada was here. Off the coast, The massive crescent formation of Spanish ships emerged from the haze, sails looming like the wings of some monstrous bird. To those on the shore, it was a terrifying spectacle. Miles of masts, hundreds of fluttering pennants, and the glitter of cannon ports yawning open. In Plymouth Harbour, the English fleet stirred into action. Lord Howard, Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher moved their squadrons with swift efficiency. The tide was against them, so they let the Armada pass by before slipping out to shadow it, their lean galleons cutting through the Channel waters. From the beginning, the English refused to meet Spain on its own terms. Instead of charging headlong to board, they danced at a distance, harassing, probing, and testing. The first skirmish took place off Plymouth itself. English galleons swooped in, firing long-range broadsides, then tacking away before the heavier Spanish ships could close. Cannonballs whistled across waves, splintering wood, tearing rigging, to the Spanish soldiers on deck, used to boarding duels. The hit-and-run tactics felt like gnats stinging a bull. Medina Sidonia tried to maintain his crescent formation, but the nimble English ships slipped between squalls and currents, refusing to offer a solid target. The Armada pressed eastward, its goal clear, Calais, where it would rendezvous with Parma's waiting army. But each day, the English harried them. Off Portland, Howard's and Drake's squadrons closed again, peppering the outer edges of the crescent. Spanish cannon roared back, smoke pouring from galleon decks, but most shots fell short. English ships, lower in the water and more maneuverable, kept a distance and darted in only to unleash devastating broadsides. Spanish captains grew frustrated. They longed to grapple the English, to unleash their soldiers in hand-to-hand combat where Spain's infantry would surely dominate. But the channel was narrow, the winds unpredictable, and the English refused to oblige. Each encounter was a running fight, not a stand-up duel. Spanish losses began to mount, not catastrophic, but steady. A few ships were damaged beyond repair, some drifted out of formation, and every day morale thinned a little more. Meanwhile, on English decks, spirits rose. Drake and Hawkins encouraged their crews with salty wit, reminding them that every cannonball fired at range was worth a dozen dead Spaniards in boarding melees. Powder and shot remained scarce, but careful aim made every volley sting. English sailors, hardened by privateering raids, cheered when they saw Spanish masts shudder under impact. They knew they couldn't destroy the Armada outright, but they could bleed it all the way to Calais. At one point, Drake famously slipped away during the night to capture a disabled Spanish ship and loot its treasure. Though this earned him accusations of piracy even in the midst of war, it also provided vital powder and shot for the English fleet. To his men, it was vintage Drake, a reminder that daring and improvisation could turn even scraps into survival. Here's your cheekier side. Picture being a Spanish soldier crammed onto a galleon, sweating in armour, itching to leap aboard an enemy deck, only to see the English darting away, cannon smoke trailing behind them like mischievous children playing tag. You'd probably mutter, "Can't they just fight properly?" But the English had no intention of fighting by Spain's rules. By the time the fleets reached the Isle of Wight, the pattern was set. Spain advanced battered but intact, while England hovered like a wolf, striking at stragglers, snapping at the flanks, then vanishing into mist. Medina Sidonia grew anxious. He had kept most of his fleet together, but delays and damage were mounting. Worse, signals between ships were constantly lost in the confusion. Smoke-obscured flags, night-swallowed lanterns, and squalls scattered vessels. The crescent remained, but it was fraying at the edges. Elizabeth's beacons continued to blaze inland, reassuring her people that the navy stood between them and invasion. In villages along the coast, men drilled with pikes, women whispered prayers, children stared at the horizon. The Armada's arrival had been terrifying, but the news that English ships had engaged and survived gave hope. For all its grandeur, the Armada had been blooded. For all its size, it had been slowed, and for all its faith in God's invincibility, it had discovered that the English had found a way to turn the narrow channel into their hunting ground. The first encounters were only skirmishes, but they set the tone. The Armada was no unstoppable juggernaut. It was a lumbering target, and England knew how to chase it. Spain's Armada was built for boarding. Its towering galleons loomed high over the waterline, castles of timber where soldiers could mass muskets and crossbows bristling, waiting for the chance to grapple an enemy ship. Once alongside, iron hooks and ropes would lash hulls together, and then Spain's finest weapon, its infantry, would pour across decks. These were men hardened in Europe's land wars, trained in the deadly tercio formation, their pikes and muskets disciplined, their swords honed for close slaughter. Philip imagined the sea would be no different than Flanders. Once Spanish boots hit enemy decks, victory would follow. England, by contrast, had reshaped its navy for a new age. John Hawkins' designs had produced sleeker galleons with long, low profiles. They sacrificed towering decks for maneuverability and, above all, for gunnery. English cannon were lighter, more standardized, and mounted for rapid reloading. Instead of waiting to close, they hammered enemies from a distance, circling like hawks, keeping out of reach of Spanish grapples. To Spain's soldiers, it was infuriating. To English sailors, it was exhilarating. Medina Sidonia tried to impose strict formation. His crescent line meant to protect supply ships in the center, while galleons shielded the flanks. But every time the English pressed, the crescent stretched, frayed, and reformed too slowly. Spanish captains wanted to charge and board, but their admiral forbade it. Without Parma's army to join, risking ships was reckless. Thus Spain's greatest strength, its soldiers, remained unused, their armour gleaming uselessly under the Channel sun. The English, meanwhile, relied on mobility and harassment. Drake and Frobisher darted in, fired broadsides, then wheeled away before the lumbering galleons could respond. Lord Howard kept the fleet coordinated with signal flags and gunfire, emphasizing movement over mass. Powder was rationed carefully. Every shot had to count. Yet even with fewer ships and fewer men, the English inflicted damage steadily. The contrast extended to provisions. Spanish ships carried masses of soldiers, consuming food and water at alarming rates. English ships carried leaner crews, living off the coast, resupplied by small vessels darting in with bread, beer, and powder. Spain was stretched thin by distance. England fought at its doorstep. Every day the Armada sailed eastward. Its holds grew emptier and its men weaker. Here's your cheeky aside. Imagine being a Spanish pikeman in full armour, sweating in the Channel sun, staring at English ships dancing out of reach. You're itching to leap into glorious combat, but all you get is splinters flying from cannonballs. You'd probably mutter, "We trained for years to fight on land, and now we're stuck as target practice." Not exactly the crusade you prayed for. The English also understood psychology. Their harassment wore down morale. Smoke, noise, sudden strikes. It all reminded Spanish sailors that they were being chased, not feared. Drake's night raids, even when minor, sowed paranoia. Medina Sidonia's insistence on order clashed with his fleet's growing exhaustion. The Armada advanced, yes, but each day the channel seemed longer, each mile more costly. At night, the differences deepened. Spanish ships anchored cautiously, lighting lanterns for signals, wary of losing formation. English ships prowled in the dark, sails furled to muffle movement. Daring to dart close, men joked that they could smell the garlic on Spanish decks when the wind shifted. In truth, both sides were exhausted, but only one side felt hunted. By the time the Armada neared the Isle of Wight, tactics had hardened into certainty. Spain would never get the close fight it wanted. England would never offer its decks to Spanish boots. Instead, the Channel itself became England's ally, funneling ships into running battles where maneuver meant more than muscle. Philip's instructions, written in neat script, back in Madrid, assumed battles could be choreographed like dances in a royal court. But the sea had its own choreography, and England knew the steps better. Spain clung to formation. England thrived in improvisation. And with every passing tide, it became clearer that the Armada's tactics were relics, while the English were inventing the future of naval war. The Channel narrowed, the winds shifted, and both fleets steered toward Calais. The Armada still looked vast, its sails white against the grey sky, But inside its hulls hunger gnawed, sickness spread, and frustration simmered. From the moment the Armada entered the Channel, the sea itself seemed to transform into a battlefield without pause. Day after day, the Spanish sailed eastward in their crescent formation, their sails taut, their cannons glinting, their soldiers restless. Day after day, the English hovered close behind or alongside, like hounds circling a bear. The result was not one grand clash, but a running fight stretched across miles of grey water, each day bringing skirmishes, smoke and splintered wood. Off Portland, the pattern hardened. English ships darted in with the tide, loosing broadsides from long-range cannon, their shots aimed at rigging, hulls, and exposed decks. Spanish ships, towering but cumbersome, replied with heavier guns, but most fell short or struck nothing but spray. English galleons wheeled away before grappling hooks could be thrown. Soldiers on Spanish decks shouted in frustration, their swords and pikes gleaming uselessly. To them, it felt less like war and more like being baited by shadows. The running battle stretched toward the Isle of Wight, where the Armada hoped to anchor. Medina Sidonia dreamed of securing a base from which to await Parma's army, but the English were determined to deny him. Drake and Hawkins pressed the attack with fury, striking from multiple angles, driving the Armada back into open sea. Smoke clung to the water as cannon fire rolled like thunder across the Channel. When Spanish ships tried to turn and close, the English slipped away, their smaller hulls cutting tighter circles in the tide. The losses were mounting. Several Spanish ships fell out of formation, battered or leaking. One exploded after a powder store caught fire, a column of flame leaping skyward as survivors flailed in the water. Another limped toward the French coast, masts cracked and decks awash. Each loss was small compared to the Armada's size, but morale sagged. The crescent was no longer seamless. It was a patchwork frayed at the edges. Meanwhile, English sailors gained confidence. They jeered across the waves, firing taunts with their muskets. Powder was still precious, but their aim improved, and each volley carried more bite. Drake's men scavenged powder from captured supply ships, turning Spain's resources against it. The English fleet fought lean and hungry, but with the home advantage they could resupply from nearby ports, while the Armada's provisions dwindled daily. The Channel itself aided the English. Narrow waters, shifting tides and fickle winds made manoeuvre difficult for the lumbering Armada. The English, familiar with every current and shoal, turned the sea into their ally. At times they darted so close that Spanish cannon fire shattered their sails, yet they slipped away before soldiers could board. The Spaniards cursed the heretic fleet that fought like foxes rather than lions, but cunning was proving sharper than valor. At night, lantern signals flickered across the Armada, trying to hold the formation together. English captains prowled in the dark, looking for stragglers. Men whispered of Drake prowling like a phantom, striking when least expected. Spanish nerves frayed, discipline faltered, and every shadow on the water seemed a threat. The Channel, once imagined as a highway for invasion, had become a gauntlet of harassment. Here's your cheeky aside. Imagine being a Spanish musketeer perched on a deck rail, armor clanking, itching for glorious combat. Across the waves, you see Drake's galleon swoop in, fire a broadside, and vanish again. You turn to your captain and grumble, "Are we fighting men or mosquitoes?" The answer, both, and the mosquitoes had better aim. By the time the Armada reached Calais, it was exhausted. Its formation held, but only barely. Ships carried scars of shot and splintered timbers. Water barrels were nearly empty. Food supplies rancid. Soldiers slept where they stood, muskets rusting in their hands. Medina Sidonia clung to discipline, but even he knew the Armada could not withstand endless harassment without a decisive clash. The English, too, felt strain. Powder was low, ships battered, crews worn thin, yet their spirits soared, for they had achieved their goal. They had driven the Armada eastward, denying it a foothold in the Channel, bleeding it with every league. They had forced Spain's mighty fleet to anchor at Calais, vulnerable, waiting for Parma's army that was still bottled up in Flanders. The running battle was not glorious, not decisive in one stroke, but it was death by 1,000 cuts, and each cut brought the Armada closer to failure. Spain had sailed with dreams of thunderous victory. Instead, it had been dragged mile by mile through a gauntlet of gunnery. The Channel had become England's weapon, and by the time the Armada anchored off Calais, the tide of history was already turning against it. By the last week of July 1588, the battered Armada at last reached Calais. After days of harassment in the Channel, Medina Sidonia managed to shepherd his remaining ships into the broad roadstead off the French coast. Anchors plunged into the shallow waters with a groan of chains. Sails were furled, and weary men slumped onto damp decks. For the first time since leaving Coruña, the Armada was still to the Spanish. The sight of land so near offered a moment of relief. To the English, watching from the distance, it looked like opportunity. The plan had always been simple on paper. The Armada would link with the Duke of Parma's seasoned army waiting in the Low Countries. Parma's 30,000 troops, veterans of Europe's fiercest campaigns, were supposed to be ferried across the Channel under the protection of the Armada's guns. Once landed in Kent, they would march on London, seize the capital, and topple Elizabeth's government. But now that the Armada floated at Calais, the flaws of the plan gaped wide. For one, Parma was not ready. His troops were blockaded by Dutch rebel ships, their shallow-draught vessels prowling the estuaries where Spain's heavier barges waited. Even if Parma could break through, he had few flat-bottomed craft suitable to ferry thousands of men across open water. Worse still, communication between Medina Sidonia and Parma was nearly impossible. Messages had to be sent by small boat through dangerous channels, often taking days. By the time one commander received instructions, the situation had already shifted. At Calais, the Armada waited, but Parma remained bottled up, unable to reach them. The delay was deadly. Ships carried only so many provisions, and the weeks of storms and fighting had already drained supplies. Barrels of water stank. Food was mouldy. Men were sick. Horses crammed below decks for the imagined conquest of England died in their stalls, their carcasses thrown overboard while gulls screeched above. Anchored within sight of France, the Armada was safer than in open battle, but each day of waiting weakened it. The English, by contrast, grew bolder. Howard, Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher kept their ships nearby, just out of range, circling like wolves. They knew Spain was stuck in place, pinned by its own dependence on Parma. Every day of delay was another chance to strike. English crews rowed ashore to resupply, drank fresh water, ate fresh bread. The home advantage had never been clearer. Medina Sidonia, trapped by duty and Philip's orders, held position. His men prayed, priests held mass, and officers tried to keep morale alive. But rumours swirled. Some said the English were preparing fire ships, recalling ancient tales of blazing vessels sent to scatter fleets. Others muttered that Parma would never come, that they were doomed to drift until hunger or disease forced them home. The stillness of Calais, broken only by gulls and the creak of rigging, felt heavier than battle. On shore, French officials looked on with alarm. Calais was nominally neutral, but the presence of the Armada turned the harbour into a powder keg. French townsfolk watched the vast Spanish fleet with unease, knowing England hovered nearby, and fearing they might become collateral in a war not their own. Markets grew tense as sailors came ashore to buy food, their purses thin, their tempers shorter. Meanwhile, the English Council of War met aboard their ships. They knew the Armada had to be broken before Parma could join. Cannon fire alone could not destroy so vast a fleet at anchor. Something more disruptive was needed, something that would shatter formation and sow panic. Plans were drawn in hushed tones, their outlines simple but daring. Fire, not shot, would break the crescent. Here's your cheeky aside. Imagine being a Spanish sailor at anchor, finally thinking you might get a good night's sleep after weeks of storms and cannon fire. You roll onto your straw mat, muttering thanks to Sir James, only to be shaken awake hours later by someone screaming, "The English have set the sea on fire." That's history's equivalent of thinking the nightmare is over, then realizing you've just reached the scariest part. As the Armada swayed at anchor in Calais, its vast hulls gleaming in the fading light, the Spanish still believed themselves formidable. But the truth was starker. They were trapped in a harbour without their army, drained of supplies, and stalked by an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. The calm before dawn would soon be broken by flames, and the stillness of Calais would give way to chaos that no prayers could extinguish. The dawn after the fireships found the Armada in utter confusion. Ships bobbed aimlessly off the Flemish coast, their anchors cut, their crescent broken. Medina Sidonia's lantern signals, meant to restore order, went largely unseen in the chaos. As the fleet tried to regroup, the English closed in, their sails taut, their cannon bristling, off the coast near the small port of Gravelines. The running battle became a pitched fight that would decide the Armada's fate. The English pressed the attack with ferocity. Drake Hawkins, Howard, and Frobisher led squadrons into the heart of the disordered Spanish line, firing broadsides at close range. Cannonballs tore into hulls, snapped masts, and sent splinters skeething through crowded decks. Smoke rolled across the water, mingling with the screams of men and the crash of timbers. English gunners, trained for rapid reloads, kept up a punishing rhythm that the Spanish could not match. Spanish ships fought back bravely. Galleons thundered with heavy broadsides. Arquebusiers fired from decks, and soldiers stood ready for boarding. But the English refused to come close enough for grappling. They stayed just out of reach, pummeling the Armada from a distance, exploiting the range of their guns. For all their valour, Spanish soldiers could do little but endure the storm of iron. Several Spanish ships took catastrophic damage. The San Mateo was shattered and forced to beach itself on the Flanders coast. The San Felipe, battered and leaking, drifted helplessly. Others, their rigging torn, collided in the swell. Each loss frayed morale further. The once proud Crescent was now a tangle of isolated ships, each struggling to survive rather than fight in concert. Medina Sidonia tried to rally his fleet, hoisting signals, urging captains to reform, but the tide ran against him. Winds pushed the Armada toward the shoals of Flanders, where shallow waters threatened to ground them. Panic surged at the thought of being trapped and annihilated. Only a sudden shift of wind saved them, pushing the fleet back into deeper water. Many Spaniards took it as a miracle. The English took it as a missed opportunity. For hours the battle raged. Cannon fire thundered, echoes rolling across the coast. English ships darted in and out, their lean hulls circling like predators. Spanish decks ran slick with blood. The soldiers tried to plug holes, man pumps and fight off fires. Yet for all the punishment, the Armada did not collapse entirely. Its ships were stout, its men disciplined, and though battered, it remained afloat. The Armada had not been destroyed, but it had been broken of any chance to dominate the Channel. Here's your cheeky aside. Imagine being a Spanish musketeer, musket clutched, praying for the English to close so you can actually use it. Instead, cannonballs scream overhead, and your officer shouts, "Stand firm." You'd probably mutter, "Firm against what?" The air. It was like showing up to a duel with a sword, only to find your opponent has a rifle. By evening, the English were running low on powder. They had poured iron into the Armada all day, but their magazines were nearly empty. Reluctantly, Howard pulled the fleet back. The Spaniards, bloodied but still afloat, drifted northward. The battle was indecisive in body count, but decisive in strategy. Spain could no longer link with Parma. The Armada, once poised to deliver invasion, was now reduced to a desperate retreat. The shoreline of Flanders faded behind them as night fell. The Spanish ships creaked, sails tattered, decks scarred, men slumped in exhaustion, nursing wounds, murmuring prayers of thanks for survival. Across the water, English crews cleaned their guns and whispered of victory. Both sides knew the truth. Gravelines had shattered the Armada's mission. What had begun as a holy crusade now looked more like a voyage of survival. The night of July 28, 1588, was quiet at first. The Armada lay at anchor off Calais. Its massive crescent stretched across the dark water, lanterns flickering on the rigging like a constellation fallen to earth. On the decks, soldiers and sailors slept in uneasy peace. Some murmured prayers, others gnawed on stale biscuit, while officers scanned the horizon for any sign of Parma's long-delayed army. For the first time in weeks there was no thunder of cannon, only the lap of waves against hulls and the groan of anchor chains. It felt almost safe. Almost. Shortly after midnight, watchmen spotted shapes drifting toward the fleet from the English lines. At first they looked like supply hulks or small fishing boats caught in the tide, but then the glow grew brighter, the sails caught flame, and sparks crackled against the night sky. The English had unleashed an ancient terror, fire ships, 8 vessels, their hulls stuffed with pitch, tar and gunpowder, sails ablaze, barrels of resin crackling in the inferno, bore down on the Armada with the wind at their backs. Panic spread like wildfire before the flames even touched. In the tight anchorage, Spanish ships were moored close together, their rigging entangled, their anchors sunk deep. To remain steady and face the fire was possible, but fear overruled reason. Shouts of "Fuego" rang out across the crescent. Drums beat frantically, officers screamed orders, and men hacked desperately at anchor cables with axes. Chains clattered into the water. Sails were hoisted in haste, and the great crescent shattered into chaos as ships scattered to escape the blazing hulks drifting inexorably closer. The fireships themselves did little physical damage. Most burned out harmlessly, their blackened skeletons bobbing uselessly in the tide. But their psychological effect was devastating. In the scramble to avoid the flames, ships collided, rigging tore, and formations collapsed. The careful crescent that had shielded Spain's supply ships for days dissolved in minutes. The Armada, invincible on paper, now looked like prey scattering before a torch. English captains watched the spectacle with grim satisfaction. Howard, Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher had planned the fireships knowing the Armada's discipline was brittle. They didn't need the flames to destroy hulls. They needed them to destroy order, and in that, the plan succeeded beyond expectation. By dawn the Spanish fleet was in disarray, drifting off Calais with anchors lost, ships separated, and morale shaken. The sailors of the Armada cursed and prayed in equal measure. Some swore they saw demons in the flames, others clutched crucifixes, begging saints for deliverance. Medina Sidonia tried to rally order, but in the chaos of night, his signals went unseen. Ships drifted toward shoals, others nearly collided. The discipline that had held through storms and skirmishes cracked wide open. Here's your cheeky aside. Imagine being a Spanish captain in the middle of the night, finally asleep after weeks of misery, when suddenly someone shakes you awake screaming, "The English set the ocean on fire." You'd stumble onto deck, squint at a wall of flames drifting straight at you and think, well, this wasn't in Philip's instructions. Sometimes all it takes to undo the best laid plans is one sleepless night. By dawn the damage was not measured in burned ships, but in shattered cohesion. The Armada's crescent was gone, vessels were scattered across the channel, anchors cut, lines tangled, crews exhausted. Supply hulks, once safely in the centre, were now exposed. Parma's hoped-for rendezvous looked impossible. Even if his barges had been ready, there was no steady wall of Spanish steel to protect them. The English, seizing the moment, bore down on the disordered fleet. Cannon were loaded, powder primed, sails tightened for pursuit. The Armada, weary and shaken, would now be forced to fight not on its own terms but on the English's. The fireships had not destroyed Spain, but they had lit the fuse of its undoing. When the sun rose over Calais on July 29, the water was littered with smouldering wrecks and drifting anchors. The Armada, once a crescent of invincibility, was now a fleet scrambling for order, and waiting for them, like wolves circling disoriented prey. The English closed in, their cannon ready to write the next chapter in fire and iron. After Gravelines, the Armada was no longer a fleet of conquest. It was a fleet of fugitives. The dream of linking with Parma's army was gone, broken by English fireships and the punishing broadsides of Gravelines. Medina Sidonia, still dutiful and unyielding, gathered what ships he could and steered north, away from the killing waters of the Channel. His new mission was survival, to get as many vessels as possible home to Spain. The retreat was slow and ragged. Many ships had lost anchors during the fireship panic at Calais, and without them, They drifted dangerously whenever winds shifted. Hulls were scarred, masts splintered, rigging frayed. The San Mateo and San Felipe, both crippled, had already grounded in Flanders. Others limped north, leaking so badly that sailors worked pumps day and night. Supply hulks, once the backbone of the fleet, were now nearly empty of food and water. The Armada was still vast, but it was hollowed, bleeding strength with every league. The English pursued cautiously, their powder supplies nearly spent. Howard, Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher shadowed the retreat, ready to pounce if Spain faltered, but they knew their limits. England had no bottomless magazines, and to drive the Armada into outright destruction was beyond their means. Instead, they kept pressure, forcing Medina Sidonia ever farther north, away from any chance of regrouping with Parma. The Channel was secure. Elizabeth's throne was safe. For the Spaniards, morale crumbled. Soldiers once eager for boarding duels now slumped in despair, gaunt from hunger, lips cracked from thirst. Sailors cursed the endless labour at pumps and ropes. The priests urged patience, claiming God had merely delayed his victory, but fewer men believed it now. Whispers spread that they were cursed, that the fireships had been the work of demons, that the Channel winds themselves were heretic allies. As the Armada passed the Straits of Dover, English coastal beacons flared again, signalling the nation of its deliverance. Crowds gathered on cliffs and harbours, watching the once invincible fleet limp northward. Songs were sung, prayers offered, and rumours exaggerated. Some claimed the Armada had been annihilated, others that thousands of prisoners had been taken. The truth that the Armada remained afloat but broken was enough. England celebrated, its small fleet having humbled the greatest power in Europe. For Medina Sidonia, the path forward was grim. He could not risk turning back into the Channel. The English waited, nor could he linger off Flanders. Parma was trapped, and provisions were gone. The only option was to circle the British Isles, sail north past Scotland, and then turn west into the Atlantic to return to Spain. It was a desperate gamble, long dangerous, and at the mercy of weather, but it was the only route left. The retreat northward felt less like navigation and more like exile. Ships drifted farther apart, some lost to storms, others crippled and abandoned. The sea itself became their greatest enemy now. Gales pushed them into the North Sea, far beyond familiar waters. Sailors who had once feared English cannon now feared the endless grey horizon. Every wave seemed larger, every gust crueler. Here's your cheeky aside. Imagine being a Spanish soldier, seasick, starving, wrapped in a damp cloak, staring at the endless grey. You signed up to fight heretics on English soil, not to be tossed around the northern seas like driftwood. You'd probably mutter, "I'd rather face Drake's cannon than another day of this slop." Hunger, after all, has less mercy than gunpowder. The Armada crept northward, its ships scarred, its men hollow-eyed. Some still clung to hope that once they rounded Scotland, calmer seas would carry them home. But others began to sense what history already knew. The greatest danger of all was yet to come, waiting in the roaring storms of the North Atlantic. When the surviving fragments of the Armada at last turned south from the wild waters around Ireland, they were scarcely recognizable as the mighty fleet that had set sail from Corunna months before. Ships limped home with sails shredded, masts splintered, and hulls leaking so badly that sailors worked the pumps day and night just to keep afloat. The once proud banners of saints were gone, torn by wind or cast overboard to lighten the load. For men who had dreamed of conquering England, the goal was no longer victory, but simply setting foot on Spanish soil alive. The voyage down the Atlantic was a trial of endurance. Provisions were gone. Many ships carried nothing but rotten biscuit and brackish water. Sailors boiled leather straps for meals, gnawed on wood softened in seawater, or starved silently. Disease raged unchecked. Dysentery turned decks into stinking misery. Scurvy rotted gums. Fever burned through cramped holds. Corpses were sewn into canvas and dropped into the sea by the dozen. Gulls circling hungrily overhead. Each day the living wondered if they would be the next bundle tipped overboard. By late September, the first survivors limped into Spanish ports. At Santander, Corunna, and San Sebastian, villagers rushed to the harbours to see what remained of the invincible armada. What they saw broke hearts, shattered hulks, sails in tatters, gaunt men crawling ashore with hollow eyes and skeletal limbs. Some kissed the ground in relief, others collapsed and never rose again. Families wept for sons and fathers who would never return, for entire ships had vanished without a trace. Of the 30 ships that had departed, barely half staggered home. Some estimates place the number as low as 60 to 70 that returned seaworthy. Of the 30,000 men who had embarked, perhaps half survived, many permanently scarred by disease or wounds. It was not just a military failure, but a human catastrophe, the scale of which stunned Europe. Philip II, cloistered in the Escurial, received the news with the stoic fatalism that marked his reign. When courtiers brought him word of the disaster, he is said to have replied, "I sent the Armada to fight men, not the elements." To him, the loss was not proof of folly, but of divine will. He retreated deeper into prayer, convinced that God had chosen to test Spain rather than reward it. His subjects, however, were less philosophical. They had sacrificed treasure, sons and ships, only to see them swallowed by sea and storm. The psychological blow was immense. For decades, Spain had seemed untouchable, its empire stretching across oceans, its silver fueling armies from Flanders to Italy. The Armada's failure shattered that aura of invincibility. Spain remained a great power, but the myth of endless might was gone. Rivals, England, the Dutch, even France, sensed that the giant could bleed. The defeat did not end Spain's dominance overnight, but it marked the beginning of decline. In England, the return of the Armada was celebrated as divine deliverance. Elizabeth's ministers spread tales of God's favour, portraying the storm as proof that heaven sided with Protestant England. Pamphlets and sermons declared that the Protestant wind had scattered Spain's pride. In reality, English gunnery had done much of the damage, but the image of the storm became a national legend. England had not just survived, it had triumphed against impossible odds. For the sailors who returned, there was little sense of legend. They limped into villages with scars and memories too bitter to recount. Many never sailed again, broken in body and spirit. Families carried grief quietly, mourning brothers and fathers who had vanished into northern seas. Across Spain, ghost towns of widows and orphans bore silent witness to the cost of Philip's holy gamble. Here's your cheeky aside. Imagine being one of those survivors, dragging yourself off a leaking hulk into Santander's harbour. A clerk asks you, "So, how was England?" You glare, missing teeth, half-starved, and croak. Didn't quite make it. Not the glorious crusade promised, but at least you lived to tell the understatement of the century. The Armada's return was not a victory march, but a funeral procession. Its survivors carried no trophies, only scars. Its ships brought back no spoils, only wreckage. What had begun as the greatest naval enterprise of its age ended as a sobering lesson. Empires, like ships, can founder when pride sails too far from reality. As the Armada turned north beyond the Firth of Forth, the English pursuit finally slackened. Howard and Drake, their powder spent and their ships battered, let the Spaniards go. England had achieved its aim. The invasion was broken, Parma isolated, Elizabeth secure. The Armada was free of enemy cannon, but not free of danger. Ahead lay Scotland, Ireland, and the wrath of the Atlantic. Medina Sidonia steered his fleet into unfamiliar waters, a ghost of its former grandeur. Anchors were gone, sails patched with ragged canvas, hulls scarred by shot and storm. The men aboard were half-starved, many sick with fever or scurvy. Provisions were nearly gone. Rats scurried across decks, gnawing at biscuit that was mouldy and crawling with worms. Water stank in the barrels, forcing sailors to sip brine and pray their stomachs would hold it. For soldiers who had once imagined parading through London, this was a bitter voyage indeed. The North Sea winds were relentless. Squalls whipped the fleet apart, scattering ships across miles. Captains lost sight of Medina Sidonia's flagship, some drifting dangerously close to the Scottish coast, others driven into open ocean. Signals meant nothing in the chaos of storm and fog. Southwesterly gales soon forced Sidonia to make the fateful decision. Rather than risk the Channel again, they would sail around Scotland and Ireland, then down the Atlantic to Spain. It was the only path left, but it was also the most perilous. These were waters the Armada barely knew, strewn with hidden shoals, unpredictable tides, and violent storms. Charts were poor, pilots unfamiliar. God's will, once proclaimed with confidence, now seemed as merciless as the grey sea itself. In September, the tempest struck with full fury. Off the coasts of Scotland and Ireland, towering waves battered the galleons, tearing sails, snapping masts like twigs. Ships collided in the dark, their hulls splintering. Men hurled into the surf, others ran aground on jagged rocks, breaking apart as survivors scrambled ashore, only to face hostile locals who saw Spaniards as enemies and stripped them of what little they had. Some ships managed to limp into bays along Ireland's western coast, but refuge was short-lived. English authorities ordered that no mercy be shown. Survivors who staggered ashore were often slaughtered by militias or executed under orders, their bodies left as grim warnings. For the men of the Armada, Ireland became less a haven than a graveyard. The sea claimed many, the sword claimed the rest. Accounts tell of sailors clinging to planks, praying to saints as waves swallowed them. Some sang hymns as they drowned, others cursed Philip for sending them on a holy mission with spoiled food and bad charts. A few, against all odds, staggered back to Spain months later with tales of horror. Hundreds drowned, hundreds more executed on foreign shores, whole squadrons vanished without trace. Here's your cheeky aside. Imagine signing up for what you're told will be a glorious crusade against heretics. Instead, you end up half dead, clinging to driftwood, off the coast of Ireland, praying the locals don't finish you off with pitchforks. At that point, you'd probably mutter, "Next time the king wants a crusade, let him sail it himself." The storms were indiscriminate. Noble and commoner alike were swept away. Seasoned captains drowned beside terrified cabin boys. Treasure ships sank with all their silver, supply hulks broke apart. Mighty galleons shattered on hidden reefs. The Atlantic had no respect for empire. What English cannon could not annihilate. The storms completed. When the last survivors of the Armada staggered ashore in Spain, the event was already transforming into legend. The truth that half the fleet had been lost to storms, disease, and poor planning was grim enough, but the story of the invincible Armada would echo far louder than the reality. Its failure reshaped Europe, not only in politics and war but in imagination. For Spain, the Armada was both a wound and a warning. Philip II did not see himself as defeated. He insisted that God had chosen to test his faith, not to strip his power. He raised new fleets in the years that followed, and Spain's empire remained vast and wealthy. For England, the Armada became a founding myth. The nation had stared down the greatest fleet in the world and survived. Pamphleteers, poets, and preachers cast the event as divine deliverance. Elizabeth herself was celebrated as the Protestant queen, protected by heaven, and her speech at Tilbury, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king," was remembered as if it had turned the tide itself. The Protestant wind, as the storms were called, became a symbol of God's favour on the English nation. In reality, the victory had been narrow. English powder was nearly spent, their fleets strained, their militias untested. But perception mattered more than fact. England emerged with a new confidence, convinced it was chosen to stand against Catholic Europe. In the decades that followed, this myth fueled exploration, colonization, and ambition far beyond its shores. The seeds of empire were planted in the smoke of the Channel. The Armada also marked a shift in naval warfare. Boarding tactics, once dominant, were exposed as obsolete. The English reliance on long-range gunnery, maneuver, and leaner ships pointed the way forward. Future navies would be built, not as floating castles but as gun platforms, able to strike from a distance. Gravelines was not just a battle, it was a preview of centuries to come. For ordinary people, the legacy was written in memory, and myth. Spanish widows wept for lost sons. English families sang songs of deliverance. Irish villagers whispered of wrecks and massacres along their shores. Survivors told stories of storm and starvation, of comrades drowned or slaughtered, of prayers whispered into endless grey skies. In taverns and marketplaces, the Armada lived on in tales exaggerated with every retelling. Hundreds of ships sunk, thousands of prisoners taken, miracles of saints and storms. Here's your cheeky aside. Imagine being one of the 7 half-mad prisoners, freed from the Bastille, a year later, hearing Englishmen boasting about how they'd crushed the invincible Armada. You might roll your eyes and mutter, "Invincible, maybe, but not waterproof." History often rewards wit more than accuracy. The Armada's failure also influenced art and identity. Painters depicted Elizabeth crowned by victory. Poets likened the storm to God's breath scattering tyranny, and playwrights drew inspiration from the drama of nations clashing at sea. Spain, too, immortalized its suffering, engravings of wrecks, hymns of martyrdom, and laments for men lost in foreign waters. In both lands, the Armada became not just an event but a cultural memory, shaping how nations saw themselves. Globally, the balance of power shifted. Spain remained formidable, but its decline had begun. England, once a secondary power, now strode onto the stage with new swagger. The Dutch, heartened, pressed their rebellion until independence was secured. The oceans themselves, once Spain's monopoly, began to open to rivals. Silver still flowed from the Americas, but now it flowed into a world less certain of Spanish supremacy. The Armada's legacy, in the end, was paradoxical. For Spain, it was disaster disguised as trial. For England, it was a narrow escape celebrated as miracle. For Europe, it was proof that no empire, however mighty, could escape the tides of history or the winds of the Atlantic. As the decades passed, the story only grew. Children in England were told of the great fleet scattered by God's hand, of Drake finishing his game of bowls before defeating Spain, of Elizabeth standing as a lion among her people. In Spain, whispers softened the defeat, casting it as fate's cruel turn rather than folly. Yet the lesson endured. The sea is no man's servant, and pride is no guarantee of victory. The final voyage of the Spanish Armada was not final in Spain's naval history, but it was final in its illusion of invincibility. The world had changed, England had found its voice, Spain had found its limits, and Europe had discovered that even the mightiest armadas can be sunk, not only by cannon fire, but by storms, hunger, and the stubborn will of smaller nations who refuse to yield. The cannons have long since fallen silent. The sails that once billowed white across the channel are tattered memories, their fabric dissolved by time and tide. Where once the Armada loomed as a floating fortress, there is now only the quiet roll of waves, the gulls wheeling above, and the whisper of history carried on the wind. Close your eyes and picture the coast of Spain in the autumn of 1588. Survivors step ashore, gaunt and hollow-eyed, their boots sinking into the sand with relief. Behind them the sea sighs, as if mocking the pride of men who thought they could command it. Ahead of them lies home, but not triumph. Their story is already passing into legend, reshaped with every telling, softened or sharpened depending on who speaks it. Breathe slowly. The storm has passed, and with it the rage of cannon and the terror of fireships. All that remains is the hush after catastrophe, when even grief grows quiet. Spain still stands, England still stands, but both are altered. The Armada's wreckage lies beneath the sea, but its meaning drifts forever above the water. A lesson that power is fleeting, that pride can founder, that survival itself is sometimes the greatest victory. Let the sound of waves fill your mind. Let the storms fade, the cries of sailors dim, the thunder of guns dissolve into silence. Rest in the knowledge that even the fiercest tempests end, that history's fury always gives way to calm. Tonight, you are safe. The sea is distant, and the Armada sails only in dream. Good night. Sweet dreams.